The coffin had been in the ground for less than 6 hours when the spades began their work. It was November 1827, Edinburgh. The Greyfriars Kirkyard lay silent under a moonless sky, the kind of darkness that was absolute, that swallowed the gravestones and the paths between them, that turned the cemetery into a landscape navigable only by those who knew it well, who had walked it many times before, who could find their way through the darkness to fresh graves that had been marked during daylight reconnaissance. The two men worked quickly, their movements practiced and efficient, born of repetition that had made this grim task routine. They had removed the turf carefully, stacking it to the side where it could be replaced to conceal evidence of their intrusion. They dug not at the head of the grave where the coffin lay deepest, but at the foot, where the wood was closer to the surface, where less earth needed to be moved to reach what lay beneath. The digging was hard work despite the November cold, the kind of labour that brought sweat despite the freezing air, that required strength and endurance and the ability to continue even when muscles screamed for rest. They reached the coffin around midnight, the spade striking wood with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet kirkyard, though there was no one to hear except the dead who surrounded them in their own graves. Silent witnesses to desecration that had become commonplace in Edinburgh, that occurred so frequently that the kirkyard's caretakers had stopped being surprised, had accepted that fresh graves would be violated, that the dead would not rest undisturbed, that resurrection was not a miracle but a crime committed for profit. The men worked a crowbar under the coffin lid, pried it open with a crack that split the night, revealing what lay inside, a woman, middle-aged, dead from fever 2 days earlier, buried that afternoon by family who had wept at the graveside, who had believed they were laying her to rest with dignity and permanence, who had no idea that before the next sunrise she would be gone from this place, stolen from the earth, sold to the highest bidder. They pulled the body from the coffin, with hands that had done this dozens of times before, hands that no longer hesitated or showed reverence, hands that treated the dead as commodity rather than as persons who had once lived and been loved. They stripped the burial clothes from the corpse, because taking the clothes was theft in the eyes of the law, but taking the body was only a misdemeanor, a quirk of legal reasoning that made corpses less protected than the garments that covered them. They wrapped the naked body in canvas, hoisted it between them, carried it to the kirkyard wall where their cart waited in the lane beyond. The grave was filled in quickly, carelessly, the earth replaced but not carefully packed, the turf laid back but noticeably disturbed to anyone who might look closely in daylight. But the men did not worry about discovery. Everyone knew graves were being robbed. Everyone knew the resurrection men operated with near impunity. Everyone knew that the demand for bodies was insatiable, that the medical schools needed corpses for anatomical study, that the supply of legally available bodies could not meet that demand. That an entire economy had grown up around the procurement of the dead through means that were illegal but tolerated, condemned publicly but facilitated privately. The cart rolled through Edinburgh's streets in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying its cargo towards Surgeons Square where the anatomists waited, where payment would be exchanged for flesh, where the woman who had been buried with prayers and tears would be laid on a dissection table and reduced to lessons in anatomy, her body opened and examined and dismembered by the medical students learning their trade through hands-on study of human remains that had been procured through violation of graves and corruption of the boundary between the living and the dead. This was the resurrection trade. This was body snatching. This was big business in 19th century Britain, where medical education demanded cadavers and where the law provided too few legally, where market forces created opportunities for those willing to do work that was ghoulish and dangerous and morally repugnant but also lucrative, where some men made fortunes by robbing graves and where others made different fortunes by purchasing what the grave robbers stole. The woman in the canvas would never know what became of her body. Her family would discover the violation when they visited the grave and found it disturbed, would be horrified and grief-stricken anew, would demand investigation that would produce no results because the resurrection men were already planning their next theft, were already watching for the next funeral, were already preparing to harvest the next crop from Edinburgh's cemeteries. The dead were currency, the grave was a bank, and the resurrection men were making withdrawals that would continue until the law changed, or until something even darker emerged from the trade in bodies, until men realized that robbing graves was labor-intensive and uncertain when murder could provide fresh corpses without the trouble of digging them up, until the business evolved from resurrection to something worse, until Edinburgh learned that not all the bodies on the dissection tables had died natural deaths. But that darkness lay ahead. For now, in November 1827, the resurrection trade continued as it had for decades, a grim commerce that operated in shadows, that violated the dead to serve the living, that transformed corpses into commodities in ways that would define an era and create legends that persist 2 centuries after the last grave was robbed and the last body was sold. Chapter 1. The Surgeon's Dilemma. Good evening and welcome back to the Bedside Historian. The night has found you wherever you are. Hope in comfort and in quiet, in a place where the darkness feels like shelter rather than threat. Tonight we journey not to distant lands or ancient times, but to Britain in the early 19th century, to an age of scientific advancement and industrial progress, to cities that were transforming through knowledge and innovation, and to a problem that existed at the intersection of medicine and morality, a problem that would create an entire criminal industry, and that would lead eventually to murders committed not from passion or greed, but from cold calculation about the market value of human flesh. Before we begin our descent into the world of the resurrection men, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I invite you to do so. These stories require extensive research, careful construction, hours spent in archives examining records that document the darker aspects of human history. Your support allows this work to continue, allows these forgotten or overlooked stories to find voice in the darkness where they belong. Now then, where are you listening from tonight? What hour finds you? Is it late where you are, the world outside gone silent and still? Or perhaps you are in those twilight hours between day and night when shadows lengthen and the boundary between past and present feels permeable? Wherever you are, whatever the hour, settle in. Let the modern world recede, and let us travel together to early 19th century Britain, to a time when medical science was emerging from centuries of superstition and ignorance, when anatomy was becoming a science rather than a dark art, and when the demand for knowledge about the human body created a market that the law could not satisfy and that crime rushed to fill. Let us begin in the anatomy schools of London and Edinburgh. The year is 1820, though the problems we will examine had been building for decades before that date. Medical education in early 19th century Britain was undergoing transformation that was both necessary and profound. For centuries, physicians had learned their trade primarily through apprenticeship and through study of ancient texts, relying on the writings of Galen and other classical authorities whose knowledge of human anatomy was often wrong, based on dissection of animals rather than humans, filled with errors that persisted because direct observation of human internal structure was rare, and was usually confined to the bodies of executed criminals whose dissection was part of their punishment. But by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, medicine was becoming more empirical, more grounded in observation and experiment, more willing to challenge ancient authority in favor of direct examination of how the body actually worked. Surgeons in particular needed detailed knowledge of anatomy because their work involved cutting into living bodies, required understanding of where arteries ran and how organs were positioned and what structures could be safely cut versus what would kill the patient if severed. The old methods of learning from books and from limited exposure to dissection were no longer adequate for training competent surgeons who could perform the increasingly complex procedures that medical advancement was making possible. The anatomy schools that emerged to meet this need were private enterprises, operated by surgeons who charged students fees to attend lectures and to participate in practical dissection sessions where bodies would be systematically opened and examined, where each student would have opportunity to hold a scalpel and to cut into human tissue and to see for himself what lay beneath the skin. The schools competed for students by offering superior instruction and better access to bodies for dissection, by employing the most skilled anatomists as lecturers, by providing facilities that allowed for the messy and unpleasant work of cutting apart cadavers in ways that were systematic and educational rather than simply ghoulish. The best-known anatomy schools were in London and Edinburgh, cities that had emerged as centres of medical education, that attracted students from across Britain and from the continent, that produced graduates who would staff hospitals and establish practices and advance medical knowledge through their training. In London, schools operated by prominent surgeons like Joshua Brooks and Charles Bell competed for students and for reputation. In Edinburgh, the medical school at the university was renowned across Europe, producing physicians and surgeons whose education was considered among the finest available anywhere. But all of these schools, from the most prestigious university programs to the smallest private establishments, faced the same fundamental problem. They needed bodies for dissection, needed them in quantities that increased each year as more students enrolled, and as the curriculum devoted more time to practical anatomy rather than simply to lecture and demonstration. And the legal supply of bodies could not possibly meet this demand, could not come close to providing enough cadavers to allow every student to gain the hands-on experience that proper training required. The law governing who could be dissected was both ancient and inadequate. Since the Murder Act of 1752, the only bodies legally available for anatomical dissection were those of executed murderers, whose dissection was explicitly included in their sentence as an additional punishment beyond death, as a final humiliation and as deterrent to others who might contemplate murder. The bodies of executed criminals were delivered to the surgeons after public hanging, were dissected in theatres where the public could attend to witness the anatomization, where the criminal's body would be reduced to its component parts in a process that was understood to be shameful and terrible, that represented the ultimate denial of Christian burial and of the resurrection of the body that Christian doctrine promised to the faithful. But executions for murder were relatively rare, perhaps 50 or 60 annually across all of England, and not all of those bodies made it to the anatomy schools because some were claimed by family members who had legal right to the corpse for burial, because some were too damaged by hanging or by the time elapsed between execution and delivery to be useful for dissection, because the supply was simply insufficient to meet demands that was growing exponentially as medical education expanded. The anatomy schools in London alone needed hundreds of bodies annually by the 1820s, needed fresh corpses that had not yet begun to decompose significantly, needed bodies of various ages and both sexes to demonstrate the range of human anatomical variation, needed a steady, reliable supply that would allow for systematic instruction rather than opportunistic dissection whenever a body happened to become available. Edinburgh's schools had similar needs, perhaps needed even more bodies given the reputation of Scottish medical education and the large number of students who enrolled seeking the best training available. The gap between legal supply and actual need was enormous and was widening each year as more anatomy schools opened and as existing schools expanded their enrollments. By 1820, the legal supply might have provided perhaps 60 bodies annually, while the actual demand was for 600 or more, a tenfold deficit that could not be addressed through legal means because the law was not going to execute more murderers simply to provide bodies for medical students, because increasing the number of capital crimes would not increase the murder rate, because the legal framework simply did not and could not provide enough cadavers to meet the needs of medical education. The medical community understood this problem intimately and discussed it extensively in their private communications and in their professional publications. The anatomists knew they were training future surgeons, knew that inadequate anatomical education would result in incompetent practitioners who would kill patients through ignorance of basic anatomy, would cut arteries they did not know existed, or would fail to recognize diseased organs, or would simply lack the manual skills that came only from practice on cadavers. The public health consequences of inadequate medical training were potentially catastrophic, would result in deaths and suffering that far exceeded whatever moral costs came from obtaining bodies through extra-legal means. So the anatomists made their peace with the system they knew was illegal and immoral, but that they justified as necessary for the greater good, as the only way to train competent surgeons when the law would not provide adequate legal access to bodies. They did not rob graves themselves, did not hire people directly to commit crimes on their behalf, but they created and sustained a market for bodies by being willing to pay for cadavers obtained through whatever means the suppliers chose to employ, by asking no questions about where bodies came from or how they had been obtained, by providing financial incentives that made body snatching profitable enough to attract people willing to do the dangerous and unpleasant work of robbing graves. The going rate for a body in 1820 was approximately £8 to £10, though prices varied by season and by the freshness and condition of the corpse. This was substantial money, more than a labourer might earn in several months of legitimate work, enough to make body snatching attractive to people who were desperate, or who were willing to overcome moral scruples in exchange for income that was difficult to obtain through legal employment. The anatomists paid in cash immediately upon delivery, with no paperwork and no records that would document the transaction or create evidence that could be used against them if the body's procurement was investigated. The relationship between the anatomists and the body snatchers was one of mutual dependence and mutual hypocrisy. The anatomists needed the bodies that the resurrectionists provided, but maintained public pretense of ignorance about how those bodies were obtained, claimed they assumed the suppliers were acting legally, expressed shock when confronted with evidence of grave robbing, as though they had no knowledge that the bodies on their dissection tables had been stolen from cemeteries. The resurrectionists needed the anatomists as purchasers who would pay well and ask no questions, who would accept bodies in whatever condition they arrived, who would maintain the fiction that the trade was legitimate even though everyone involved knew it was based entirely on crime. This arrangement had existed for decades by 1820, had become so normalized that anatomy students wrote casually in their letters and diaries about the bodies that arrived at their schools, sometimes mentioned that graves had been robbed to provide the cadavers, but treated this as unremarkable, as simply how things worked, as an unfortunate necessity that was regrettable but unavoidable given the deficiencies in the law. The public knew that grave robbing occurred, read about it in newspapers when particularly egregious cases came to light, expressed outrage and horror when their own family members' graves were violated, but also understood at some level that medical progress required bodies for dissection, and that legal supply was inadequate to meet that need. The tension between these competing concerns, between the desire to protect the dead from desecration and the recognition that medical education required cadavers, created a kind of cognitive dissonance in British society during the early 19th century. People wanted competent surgeons who understood anatomy, wanted medical care that was grounded in scientific knowledge rather than in superstition and guesswork, but they also wanted their dead to remain undisturbed in their graves, wanted Christian burial to be final and permanent, wanted to believe that the bodies of their loved ones would rest in peace until the resurrection promised by their faith. These desires were incompatible given the legal framework that existed in 1820. Something had to give. Either the law had to change to provide more bodies legally, or the illegal trade in bodies would continue and would likely expand, or medical education would have to contract and accept inadequate training for future physicians. The first option required legislative action that was politically difficult because it would require acknowledging the need for bodies and creating legal mechanisms to obtain them, mechanisms that would necessarily involve taking bodies from people who had not consented and whose families might object. The second option meant accepting an ongoing criminal enterprise that violated graves and that treated the dead as commodities. The third option meant accepting that future generations would receive worse medical care than was technically possible to provide. Britain in 1820 chose the second option by default, by failing to reform the law, by allowing the resurrection trade to continue operating in the shadows while maintaining public disapproval of grave robbing, even as the anatomical schools that created demand for stolen bodies continued to expand and to train more students who required more bodies for their education. The hypocrisy was profound but was sustainable as long as the grave robbing remained relatively discreet, as long as the resurrectionists took bodies from pauper graves and from people without families to protect them, as long as the middle and upper classes could believe that their own dead was safe, even while the poor were being harvested from their graves to feed the anatomy schools. But the system was unstable, was building toward crisis, was creating incentives that would eventually lead from grave robbing to something worse, to a realization that obtaining fresh bodies was easier through murder than through resurrection, that the market for cadavers did not distinguish between bodies that had died naturally and bodies that had been killed deliberately, that the anatomists who asked no questions about where bodies came from would not ask questions about whether the supplier had waited for natural death or had hastened it along. The surgeon's dilemma, the impossible choice between adequate training and respect for the dead, would eventually force legal reform, but only after scandal and murder had made the existing system untenable. Only after the public learned that the bodies on dissection tables sometimes belonged to people who had been killed specifically to be sold. Only after the cost of maintaining the fiction became higher than the cost of changing the law. But that reckoning lay ahead in 1820, still a decade away from the murders that would finally force change. For now, the anatomy schools operated with bodies obtained through grave robbing. The resurrectionists plied their grim trade with increasing organisation and professionalism, and British medical education advanced on a foundation of violated graves and desecrated corpses, building knowledge through means that everyone involved knew were wrong, but that everyone involved convinced themselves were necessary. Chapter 2. The Anatomy Act's Absence. The legal framework that created and sustained the resurrection trade was not the result of deliberate policy designed to encourage grave robbing, but rather emerged from the intersection of ancient laws about the treatment of criminal bodies, changing attitudes toward medical science, and the peculiar status of corpses in English common law, a status that made stealing a body less serious legally than stealing the clothes it was buried in. The foundation of the problem lay in how English law categorized human remains. A corpse was not property in the legal sense, could not be owned by anyone, belonged neither to the deceased person nor to their surviving relatives, existed in a kind of legal limbo where it had to be disposed of according to certain requirements, but where no one had ownership rights that would make its theft equivalent to theft of property. This meant that taking a body from a grave was not robbery or larceny under English law, was instead a misdemeanor, a minor offence that typically resulted in small fines or brief imprisonment if prosecuted at all. But the clothes, the jewellery, the coffin, anything that had been property of the living person or that had been purchased for the burial, these items retained their status as property even after burial, and taking them was theft in the full legal sense, subject to serious punishment including potential transportation or hanging, depending on the value of what was stolen. This created the bizarre situation where resurrectionists would carefully strip bodies naked before removing them from graves, would leave behind the burial shroud and any personal effects, would take only the corpse itself because taking anything else would transform a misdemeanor into a felony, and would increase both the likelihood of prosecution and the severity of punishment if convicted. The resurrectionists understood this legal distinction intimately, and operated within its bounds with careful attention to what they could take without triggering serious legal consequences. They were criminals, but they were not stupid, knew that the system would tolerate body snatching to some degree because the anatomists needed bodies, and because the public did not want to confront the alternatives, knew that as long as they confined themselves to taking corpses without the associated property, they would face minimal legal risk even if caught. The question of why the law did not change, to address this obvious problem, why Parliament did not simply pass legislation making body snatching a more serious crime or alternatively, making more bodies legally available to anatomists, had answers that were complex and that reflected the political and social tensions of early 19th century Britain. The issue touched on questions about the sanctity of burial, about class privilege, about the relationship between the state and the church, about scientific progress versus traditional religious beliefs, about whose bodies could legitimately be used for purposes their owners would never have consented to. The existing law allowing dissection of executed murderers dated from 1752, from the Murder Act which had been designed primarily to increase the terror associated with conviction for murder, to add post-mortem humiliation to the punishment of death, to create additional deterrent beyond the hanging itself. The Acta specified that the bodies of executed murderers should either be hung in chains for public display or should be delivered to surgeons for dissection, with the choice between these fates being left to the sentencing judge. The purpose was punishment, not medical education, was about using the criminal's body to send messages about the consequences of crime, rather than about advancing anatomical knowledge. By the early 19th century, this law was woefully inadequate for the needs of medical education, provided perhaps 5% of the bodies that anatomy schools required, left a massive gap that was being filled entirely through legal means. Everyone involved in medical education understood this. The anatomists knew it. The students knew it. The government officials who oversaw medical licensing knew it. But changing the law proved remarkably difficult despite the obvious need, and despite periodic scandals when particularly egregious body snatching cases came to public attention. The resistance to legal reform came from multiple directions and reflected genuinely held beliefs, as well as self-interest and political calculation. The Church opposed any expansion of who could be dissected because dissection was understood to interfere with bodily resurrection, with the Christian belief that the dead would rise in their physical bodies on Judgment Day, that the body needed to be intact and properly buried in consecrated ground to participate in this resurrection. Anatomization was seen as a kind of damnation, a denial of the resurrection, appropriate only for criminals whose sins had placed them beyond salvation, but inappropriate for ordinary Christians who had died in good standing with the Church. The poor feared that any change to the law would make their bodies vulnerable to dissection in ways that the wealthy would escape, that legal reform would create a two-tier system where those who could afford elaborate burial protections would remain safe while those buried in pauper graves would become legal, sources of cadavers for anatomy schools. This fear was not paranoid but was grounded in the reality of how the resurrection trade actually operated, with body snatchers preferentially targeting graves of the poor because those graves were less well protected, less carefully monitored, less likely to have family members who could afford to pursue prosecution if the theft was discovered. The middle and upper classes were ambivalent about reform because while they wanted well-trained physicians, they also wanted assurance that their own bodies and their family members' bodies would not end up on dissection tables. They were willing to tolerate body snatching as long as it primarily affected other people, as long as the system had informal mechanisms for protecting those with resources to hire guards or to purchase iron coffins or to bury in well-monitored churchyards. Legal reform that might make bodies more readily available to anatomists threatened to eliminate these protective mechanisms, threatened to create a system where respectability and wealth could not guarantee some safety from anatomization. The practical politics of passing legislation also created obstacles to reform. Any bill that proposed to make more bodies available for dissection would be politically unpopular, would generate opposition from religious groups and from working-class advocates, would be difficult to pass even if political leaders privately agreed that reform was necessary. The members of Parliament who would have to vote for such legislation knew that supporting it might cost them votes in future elections, might generate accusations that they were facilitating desecration of the dead, might align them with positions that were easy for opponents to characterize as impious or as showing contempt for ordinary people. So the law did not change despite the obvious inadequacy of the existing framework. Despite the fact that everyone involved in medical education knew that the system depended on grave robbing, despite periodic calls for reform from medical organizations and from some enlightened commentators who recognized that the status quo was untenable, the political will to address the problem did not exist in the 1810s and 1820s, would not exist until scandal forced action, until the consequences of inaction became worse than the political costs of reform. Meanwhile, the resurrection trade flourished in the gap between what the law provided and what the anatomy schools needed. The trade became increasingly organized and professional over the early decades of the 19th century, evolved from opportunistic grave robbing by individuals into systematic operations run by gangs who divided territories and who developed sophisticated techniques for identifying, extracting and delivering bodies' beds to anatomists who paid well and asked no questions. The anatomists, for their part, maintained the fiction that they did not know where bodies came from or how they were obtained, insisted that they simply purchased cadavers from suppliers who they assumed were acting legally, claimed ignorance of the grave robbing that everyone knew was the source of nearly every body that arrived at their dissecting rooms. This willful blindness allowed them to benefit from the resurrection trade while avoiding direct complicity in crime, allowed them to maintain respectable public positions while privately facilitating and financing an industry based entirely on violation of graves and desecration of the dead. The contradiction was stark and was recognized by critics who pointed out that the anatomists could not genuinely believe that the dozens of bodies delivered to their schools each season were all legally obtained, that the only legal source was executed murderers whose numbers were far too small to account for the supply. But the anatomists had strong incentives to maintain the pretense, because acknowledging what they knew would make them accessories to crime, would potentially expose them to prosecution, would certainly expose them to public condemnation that could damage their reputations and their schools. The medical journals of the period sometimes discussed the body supply problem in coded language, referred to difficulties in obtaining subjects for anatomical instruction, expressed hope that the law might be reformed to provide adequate legal sources, but carefully avoided explicit acknowledgement that existing anatomical instruction depended almost entirely on stolen bodies. The public discussion of anatomy focused on the benefits of improved medical training, on the advances in surgical technique that came from better anatomical knowledge, on the lives that would be saved by competent physicians, but avoided dwelling on how that training was actually accomplished, on whose bodies were being used and how those bodies were obtained. This consensus of silence, this mutual agreement to avoid discussing openly what everyone knew privately, sustained the system for decades and allowed the resurrection trade to operate with minimal interference despite being technically illegal, and despite generating periodic outrage when particularly sympathetic victims had their graves robbed or when body snatchers were caught in the act. The prosecutions that did occur typically resulted in minor punishments, fines of a few pounds or imprisonment for a few weeks, penalties that were insignificant compared to the profits that could be made from selling bodies to anatomists. The resurrectionists understood that the system tolerated their activities, that prosecution was unlikely, and that punishment, if it occurred, would be minor, that the real risks came not from the law, but from the families and communities who would sometimes take justice into their own hands if grave robbers were caught, who might beat them severely or might kill them, who felt that the violation of graves deserved punishment more severe than the law provided. The violence that occasionally resulted from these confrontations was generally ignored by authorities, was treated as understandable if regrettable response to grave robbing was not prosecuted with the same vigour that might have been applied if the victims had been engaged in legal activities. The absence of effective legal remedy for body snatching created a kind of frontier justice around cemeteries, with families and communities taking on themselves the responsibility for protecting graves because they could not rely on the law to do so adequately. The watchhouses that appeared in many cemeteries, the iron cages and mortsafes that protected individual graves, the armed patrols that some communities organised, all of these measures reflected the understanding that the law would not prevent grave robbing and that protection had to come from private action rather than from public authority. But these protective measures were expensive and were therefore available primarily to those with resources to pay for them, creating the two-tier system that reformers had warned about, where the wealthy could protect their dead through elaborate burial security, while the poor remained vulnerable to resurrection. The graves in fashionable, well-maintained churchyards were relatively safe because they were monitored and because families could afford protective measures. The graves in pauper burial grounds were harvested systematically because they had no protection, because the people buried there had no families who could afford to guard them, because the resurrectionists knew they could work in such places with minimal risk of interference. The anatomy schools benefited enormously from this arrangement, received steady supply of bodies without having to dirty their own hands or to acknowledge directly that they were financing grave robbing. The system worked for everyone except the dead and their families, worked as long as the resurrectionists confined themselves to taking bodies from graves and did not move to more direct methods of obtaining fresh corpses, worked as long as the public could maintain the fiction that body snatching was an unfortunate problem that affected mainly the poor, and that was being addressed as well as could be expected, given the competing demands of medical progress and respect for the dead. The Anatomy Act that would eventually reform this system and make body snatching obsolete would not pass until 1832, would not become law until scandal had made the existing arrangement politically untenable, until murder had demonstrated that the resurrection trade created incentives that led inevitably to killing for profit, until the cost of maintaining the status quo exceeded the political costs of reform. But in the 1820s, the law remained unchanged. The resurrection trade continued to expand, and British anatomy was built on a foundation of violated graves and legal fictions that everyone involved knew were lies, but that no one was quite ready to confront honestly. Chapter 3. The Professional Resurrectionists. The men who made their living robbing graves were not the desperate criminals that popular imagination might suggest, but were often skilled professionals who approached their work with organisation and expertise, who developed techniques and tools specific to the task, who operated in gangs with defined territories and internal hierarchies, who treated body snatching as a business rather than as opportunistic crime. The most successful resurrectionists were those who operated in London and Edinburgh, the cities with the largest concentrations of anatomy schools and therefore the greatest demand for bodies. In London, the trade was dominated by several gangs who had established working relationships with specific anatomists, who could reliably deliver bodies of good quality with minimal delay between death and delivery, who understood what the anatomists wanted and who could provide it consistently. In Edinburgh, the trade was similarly organised, though the smaller size of the city and the concentration of medical education at the university created somewhat different dynamics than existed in London's more fragmented market. The London resurrectionists included men who became famous or infamous depending on perspective, whose names appeared in newspaper accounts and court records, who were known to anatomists and to the public as the primary figures in the resurrection trade. Ben Crouch was perhaps the most notorious, operated for decades in the early 19th century, supplied bodies to multiple anatomy schools, was arrested numerous times but was never imprisoned for long enough to significantly interrupt his business. He understood the legal system intimately, knew exactly what he could do without triggering serious prosecution, maintained relationships with constables and magistrates that allowed him to operate with relative impunity as long as he stayed within certain boundaries. The gang that Crouch led or was associated with at various times included other men who became well known in the trade. Joseph Naples, Patrick Murphy, Thomas Williams. These names appeared repeatedly in accounts of body-snatching prosecutions, in complaints from cemetery officials, in the records of anatomy schools that purchased their products. They worked sometimes in cooperation and sometimes in competition, sometimes forming alliances to divide territories or to coordinate activities, and sometimes fighting over access to particular burial grounds or to particular anatomists who paid well. The work of resurrection required specific skills and tools that distinguished professional body snatchers from amateurs who might attempt the crime opportunistically. The professionals developed techniques that allowed them to open graves quickly and with minimal visible disturbance, that reduced the risk of being caught by cemetery watchmen or by early morning visitors, that maximized the number of bodies they could extract in a single night's work. They used the specialized implements including narrow spades designed for digging in confined spaces, crowbars and hooks for opening coffins and extracting bodies, canvas sacks for transporting corpses, carts designed to look innocuous, but that had hidden compartments for concealing bodies. The typical method for opening a grave involved digging not at the head where the coffin lay deepest, but at the foot where less earth needed to be removed to reach the wood. A small shaft would be excavated down to the coffin lid, perhaps 3 feet across and 4 or 5 feet deep, requiring removal of far less soil than excavating the entire grave would require. Once the coffin was reached, the lid would be broken open using crowbars, just enough to create openings sufficient to pull the body through. The corpse would be extracted using hooks or ropes, would be stripped of burial clothing which would be left in the grave to avoid the legal complications that came from taking property, would be wrapped in canvas and removed from the cemetery. The earth removed from the grave would be carefully set aside on canvas sheets so it could be replaced efficiently, so minimal evidence would remain of the disturbance. The turf that had covered the grave would be lifted intact and would be replaced after the body was removed and the earth was returned, creating appearance of an undisturbed grave that might not be detected until family members visited and noticed subsidence or other signs that the ground had been disturbed. The entire process from beginning excavation to departing with the body could be accomplished in under an hour by experienced resurrectionists working efficiently, though the work was physically demanding and required strength and stamina, especially in winter, when the ground was frozen or when multiple graves needed to be opened in a single night. The timing of resurrection was crucial for several reasons. Bodies needed to be obtained fresh, ideally within a day or two of burial, because decomposition made them less valuable to anatomists who wanted cadavers that were still suitable for detailed dissection. The resurrectionists therefore needed intelligence about recent burials, needed to know when funerals had occurred and where bodies had been interred, needed to identify targets before the bodies became too decomposed to be saleable. This intelligence was gathered through various means, including attendance at funerals, bribery of cemetery workers who could provide information about burials, observation of church records that listed deaths and burials, networks of informants who could report when someone had died and where they would be buried. The seasonal nature of death created patterns in the resurrection trade that affected both supply and pricing. Winter months, when cold weather preserved bodies and when respiratory diseases killed more people, provided the best combination of availability and quality. Summer months, when heat accelerated decomposition and when death rates were generally lower, created scarcity that drove up prices, but also made the work more unpleasant because bodies decomposed quickly and the smell of decay was more pronounced. The resurrectionists preferred winter work not just because prices were lower and competition was less intense, but because the work itself was more bearable when the bodies were fresh and when cold weather made the physical labor less exhausting. The relationship between resurrectionists and anatomists was carefully managed on both sides to maintain plausible deniability while ensuring reliable supply. The anatomists did not place orders for specific bodies or negotiate directly about which graves should be robbed, instead made known generally that they were in market for cadavers and would pay specific rates for bodies delivered in good condition. The resurrectionists would appear at anatomy schools with bodies, would negotiate prices based on the freshness and condition, and sometimes on the scarcity of supply, would receive payment in cash with no documentation and no questions asked about where the body had come from or how it had been obtained. The pricing structure reflected various factors, including the difficulty of obtaining particular bodies, the season, the current level of supply relative to demand, and the condition of the corpse. A fresh body obtained from an easily accessible grave in winter might sell for £8. The same body obtained with difficulty or delivered during summer scarcity might bring £12 or £15. Bodies of children or of adults with unusual anatomical features that made them particularly valuable for teaching purposes might command premium prices. Bodies that had begun to decompose or that showed signs of disease that made them less suitable for dissection would be worth less, might be rejected entirely if the condition was too poor. The territory disputes between resurrection gangs sometimes became violent, with competing groups fighting for access to particular cemeteries or to particular anatomists who paid well. The gangs established informal boundaries that defined which burial grounds each group could work, with violations of these boundaries leading to confrontations and sometimes to betrayals to authorities. A gang that felt its territory was being poached might inform cemetery officials or police about a rival gang's activities, might sabotage their operations by alerting watchmen, might engage in direct violence to discourage competition. These disputes were generally settled privately rather than through any formal mechanism, with the gangs negotiating or fighting until equilibrium was established and territories were recognized. The economics of the resurrection trade were such that successful resurrectionists could earn substantial incomes, could make more in a few nights of grave robbing than labourers could earn in months of legitimate work. But the work was irregular, dependent on supply of fresh bodies and on avoiding arrest, and the money earned was often spent quickly on drink and gambling and other expenses that kept most resurrectionists from accumulating significant wealth despite their high earnings. The trade attracted people who were willing to do unpleasant and risky work for good pay, who had the physical strength and the moral flexibility to dig up bodies and sell them, who could operate in the criminal underworld without being consumed by it. Some resurrectionists worked full-time at the trade, made it their primary occupation, developed reputations and relationships that sustained them across years or decades of activity. Others worked part-time, supplementing other income with occasional body snatching when opportunities arose or when money was needed. Still others were involved peripherally, serving as lookouts or as sources of information, or as handlers who transported bodies or negotiated with anatomists, taking smaller cuts of the profits in exchange for lesser roles in the actual grave robbing. The infrastructure that supported the resurrection trade included safe houses where bodies could be stored temporarily, where resurrectionists could rest between jobs, where tools and carts could be kept. It included networks of carters and boatmen who could transport bodies across London or Edinburgh without attracting attention, who knew routes that avoided checkpoints and that minimized risk of discovery. It included corrupt officials who accepted bribes to look the other way, who would warn resurrectionists when investigations were planned, who would ensure that prosecutions, if they occurred, would result in minimal punishment. The social status of resurrectionists was complicated and contradictory. They were criminals engaged in activity that disgusted most people, that violated fundamental taboos about respect for the dead, but they also provided service that the anatomists needed and that the medical profession depended upon even while publicly condemning grave robbing. The resurrectionists occupied a liminal social space, tolerated because they were useful, despised because of what they did, operating in shadows but known to authorities and to the public, living outside respectable society but enabling the medical advances that respectable society valued. The families of resurrectionists sometimes did not know the details of how their fathers or husbands earned money, were told vague stories about night work or about employment that could not be discussed. Other families knew and were complicit, helped with the work or benefited from the income without asking too many questions about its source. The children of resurrectionists sometimes followed their fathers into the trade, learned the deals of the skills and the contacts and the techniques that made successful body snatching possible, inherited territory, and a relationship with anatomists perpetuated the business across generations. The professional resurrectionists saw themselves not as monsters, but as businessmen meeting market demand, as people doing difficult work that others were unwilling to do, as necessary components of a system that everyone recognized was imperfect but that no one seemed able or willing to reform. They justified their activities through various rationalizations, arguing that the dead had no use for their bodies, that medical progress required cadavers and that legal supply was inadequate, that they were providing service to society even if that service required violating graves and desecrating the dead. Whether these justifications allowed them to sleep at night or whether they were haunted by what they did was not something most resurrectionists discussed publicly. It was kept private if they felt guilt or shame about their occupation. The trade would continue throughout the 1820s, would reach its peak around 1828 when demand was highest and when the gangs were most organized and most brazen in their activities. But the trade was also approaching crisis, was creating conditions that would lead from grave robbing to murder, from resurrection to something darker, from an illegal trade that was tolerated to crimes that were so shocking they would finally force the legal reform that had been needed for decades but that had been politically impossible until scandal made inaction more costly than change. Chapter 4. A Night's Work. The work began hours before the spades touched earth, began with observation and intelligence gathering, with the careful reconnaissance that separated successful professional resurrectionists from amateurs who were caught quickly or who wasted effort on graves that yielded nothing useful. The gangs maintained networks of informants who could provide information about recent deaths and upcoming burials, who knew which graves would be worth opening and which would likely contain bodies too old or too diseased to be saleable. These informants included cemetery workers who could be bribed for information about burial schedules, church sextons who maintained records of who was buried where, even undertakers who might provide details about recent funerals in exchange for money or other considerations. The information was valuable because it allowed the resurrectionists to target specific graves rather than digging randomly, to focus their efforts on the bodies that had been buried recently enough to be fresh, but not so recently that the grave would be under close observation. The resurrectionists would attend funerals when possible, not as mourners but as observers, would stand at respectful distance watching the burial, noting details about the grave's location and depth, assessing how difficult it would be to open, identifying any protective measures like iron cages or watch houses that might complicate resurrection. They would note whether the deceased was young or old, male or female, whether the burial was in a well-monitored churchyard or in a pauper's ground, whether family members seemed likely to visit the grave frequently, or whether the deceased appeared to have been friendless and unmourned. All of this information would factor into decisions about which graves to target and when. The timing of the actual resurrection was calculated based on several considerations. The grave needed to have been filled in completely, and the mourners needed to have departed, which typically meant waiting at least until the evening of burial day, or more commonly until the following night. But waiting too long meant the body would begin to decompose and would lose value, meant that winter graves needed to be opened within 2 or 3 days of burial, while summer graves needed to be opened even more quickly. The optimal time was usually the night after burial, or perhaps the second night, when the grave was still fresh, but when the initial period of close observation by family had passed. The location of the cemetery mattered enormously. Urban burial grounds in the heart of London or Edinburgh were risky because they were surrounded by occupied buildings, because noise carried easily, because there were people nearby who might notice activity and alert authorities. Rural cemeteries or burial grounds on the edges of cities were preferable because they offered more isolation, because the resurrectionist could work with less concern about being observed, because escape routes were more available if watchmen or angry family members appeared. But the rural graveyards also tended to bury fewer people, and therefore offered less frequent opportunities, required the resurrectionist to travel farther to find work. The pauper burial grounds were the most heavily targeted locations because they offered the worst security and the least family protection. These were places where the indigent dead were buried in mass graves or in unmarked individual graves where families, if they existed, could not afford watchmen or protective devices, where cemetery officials were often corrupt and could be bribed to look the other way, where the bodies were accessible and the risk of interference was minimal. The resurrectionist could work systematically through pauper grounds, opening multiple graves in a single night, harvesting bodies with efficiency that came from experience and from the knowledge that no one was watching closely enough to stop them. The team that went into the cemetery typically consisted of 3 or 4 men, enough to do the work efficiently, but not so many that the group would be conspicuous or that the profits would be divided too many ways. One man would serve as lookout, would watch for approaching watchmen or for other signs of danger, would alert the others if they needed to flee. The other 2 or 3 would do the actual digging and extraction, would take turns with the spades because the work was exhausting, would work as quickly as possible to minimize the time spent in the cemetery. The tools were specialized and were carried in bags that could be easily dropped and abandoned if flight became necessary. The spades had narrow blades that allowed for digging in confined spaces, that were designed to remove earth efficiently from the small shaft that would be excavated to reach the coffin. The crowbars and hooks were sturdy enough to break coffin lids and to extract bodies, were made of iron that would not break under the stress of prying open wood that was sometimes quite solid. The canvas sacks were large enough to hold an adult body folded or doubled up, were dark-coloured to be less visible in moonlight, had ropes that could be tied to secure the load during transport. The digging proceeded quietly, with the men working in near silence, communicating through gestures rather than words, minimizing noise that might carry to watchmen or to people living near the cemetery. The spades made soft sounds as they cut into earth, sounds that were muffled and that faded quickly into the night, sounds that were less likely to attract attention than voices would be. The men worked steadily, but not frantically. understanding that speed was important but that careless haste could result in noise or in mistakes that would compromise the operation. The shaft was excavated down to the coffin lid, with the earth being piled carefully onto canvas sheets so it could be replaced efficiently. The men knew from experience approximately how deep they would need to dig based on the age and apparent wealth of the grave, knew that pauper graves tended to be shallower because they were dug cheaply, knew that graves in churchyards might be deeper and might require more work to reach the coffin. When the spade struck wood, the sound was distinctive, a hollow thunk that told the men they had reached their target and could transition from digging to extraction. The coffin lid was the next obstacle, needed to be broken open to access the body, needed to be breached in ways that allowed the corpse to be removed, but that did not require excavating the entire coffin, which would take far too long. The men would work crowbars under the lid near the head of the coffin, would pry upward until the wood cracked, would widen the opening until it was large enough to pull the body through. The sound of wood breaking was louder than the digging had been, but was still relatively muffled by being below ground level, was a risk the resurrectionists accepted as necessary to the work. The body was grasped by the shoulders or the arms, was pulled upward through the broken coffin lid, was extracted from the grave with effort that varied depending on the size and weight of the deceased. A small woman or a child could be lifted easily by one man. A large adult male might require two men pulling together, might need to be manoeuvred carefully to fit through the opening in the coffin lid. The bodies were never treated with particular gentleness, were handled as cargo rather than as former persons, were pulled and pushed and folded as necessary to extract them efficiently. The stripping of burial clothes happened immediately upon extraction, with the men working quickly to remove the shroud or whatever garments the deceased had been buried in. The clothes were thrown back into the grave to avoid the legal complications that would come from taking property, to keep the crime classified as a misdemeanor rather than escalating it to felony theft. The naked body was then wrapped in the canvas sack, was tied securely, was set aside while the grave was hastily refilled. The refilling was much quicker than the excavation had been, because precision was not important, because the earth just needed to be returned to the hole and the turf replaced on top to create the appearance of an undisturbed grave. The men worked quickly, shoveling earth back into the shaft, tramping it down to reduce the obviousness of subsidence, replacing the turf in approximately its original configuration. The work was never perfect, would not survive careful inspection, but in the darkness it looked plausible, looked like it might be an undisturbed grave if no one examined it too closely. The extraction of one body typically took 45 minutes to an hour, from beginning excavation to departing with the corpse. The resurrectionists could sometimes work multiple graves in a single night if they were in a pauper ground with many recent burials, could harvest 3 or 4 bodies if conditions were favourable, if the graves were close together, and if no interruptions occurred. But working multiple graves increased risk of detection, meant spending more time in the cemetery, meant more opportunities for something to go wrong. The transportation of bodies from cemetery to anatomy school was a critical part of the operation that required as much planning as the actual grave robbing. The bodies needed to be moved through cities' streets without attracting attention, needed to be concealed in ways that would prevent their discovery if the cart was stopped by watchmen or constables. The resurrectionists used carts that had false bottoms or hidden compartments, used barrels or crates that appeared to contain legitimate cargo but that actually held bodies, used routes through city streets that avoided main thoroughfares and checkpoints. The timing of transport was usually in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the streets were quietest, when most people were asleep, when the night watch was least vigilant. The carts moved slowly to avoid attracting attention, stopped at intervals to allow the men to observe whether they were being followed or whether any obstacles lay ahead. The drivers of the carts were often different men from those who did the actual grave robbing, were specialists in navigation and in talking their way past any officials who might stop them, were skilled at providing plausible explanations for why they were moving through city streets at 3 a.m. with barrels in their cart. The delivery to anatomy schools typically occurred in early morning hours, with the cart pulling into a courtyard or alley adjacent to the school, with the bodies being unloaded quickly and taken inside where they would be examined by the anatomist or his assistant, who would determine whether the bodies were acceptable and what price would be paid. The transaction was swift, money changing hands immediately, the resurrectionists departing with their payment, the anatomist taking possession of bodies he would not ask questions about, and that he would use for dissection within the next day or two before decomposition made them unsuitable for anatomical study. The entire cycle from identifying a grave to delivering the body to an anatomy school was a coordinated operation that required multiple skills and multiple participants, that succeeded because of careful planning and because of the tolerance of a system that condemned grave robbing publicly while depending on it privately. The night's work was grim and unpleasant, but it was also professional, was executed with competence that came from experience, was a business operation that happened to involve dead bodies and violated graves, but that followed many of the same patterns as legitimate trade in other commodities. The resurrectionists would return home at dawn, would sleep through the day, would begin planning the next night's work or the work for later in the week when the next promising funerals occurred. The money they earned would be spent on necessities and on pleasures, on food and rent and drink and gambling, on the expenses of life lived at the margins of society where today's earnings might be gone tomorrow, and where planning beyond the immediate future was pointless because the risks of the trade meant that arrest or violence could end the career at any moment. Chapter 5. The Families Fight Back. The discovery that a grave had been robbed was a horror that compounded grief in ways that families were often unable to process, that transformed mourning into rage and helplessness, that violated not just the body of the deceased, but the trust that death would bring rest and that burial would be final and permanent. The typical discovery occurred when family members visited a grave days or weeks after burial and found the earth disturbed, found subsidence or fresh soil that indicated digging had occurred, found in some cases that the grave had been opened and incompletely refilled. The evidence of violation was obvious to anyone who looked. The family would alert cemetery officials, who would sometimes agree to open the grave officially to determine whether the body remained, would find the coffin broken open and empty except for the burial clothes that had been left behind, would confirm what the family already knew or suspected, that their loved one had been stolen, that the body was gone, that it had almost certainly been sold to anatomists and by now had been dissected and destroyed. The emotional impact of this discovery was profound and was recorded in letters and diaries and in testimony given during the occasional prosecutions of resurrectionists. Families described feeling violated in ways that went beyond the physical theft of the body, described sense that the deceased had been dishonored, that their rest had been disturbed, that the Christian burial that should have been permanent had been rendered meaningless by criminals who cared nothing for the dead or for the grief of the living. The violation was spiritual as well as physical, touched on deep beliefs about the sanctity of burial and about the resurrection of the body that Christian doctrine promised. The legal remedies available to families were limited and generally unsatisfying. Body snatching was a misdemeanor punishable by small fines or brief imprisonment, penalties that seemed absurdly inadequate for crime that felt like it should be among the most serious offences imaginable. Even when resurrectionists were caught and prosecuted, the punishments were minimal, might amount to a few pounds fine or a few weeks in jail, after which the criminals would return to their trade having suffered inconvenience but not serious consequences. The families had no standing to bring civil suits for damages because corpses were not property under English law, belonged to no one, generated no legal rights that could be violated in ways that would support financial recovery. So the families took matters into their own hands, organised private protective measures, created systems of surveillance and physical barriers that were designed to make grave robbing difficult enough that the resurrectionists would target other cemeteries, other bodies, other families. The protective measures that emerged during the early 19th century ranged from simple to elaborate, from inexpensive to costly, from reasonably effective to largely symbolic, but all reflected the same desperate need to protect the dead when the law would not. The simplest protective measure was the watch, the posting of family members or hired guards at gravesides for the days or weeks after burial when the risk of resurrection was highest. The watchers would sit through the night near fresh graves, would maintain vigil armed with clubs or pistols, would attempt to frighten away any resurrectionists who appeared. The watches were exhausting and were expensive in terms of lost work time or in payments to hired guards, were difficult to sustain for extended periods, because eventually people needed to sleep and needed to return to their ordinary lives and could not maintain constant vigil indefinitely. Some cemeteries built watch houses, small structures where guards could shelter while maintaining observation over the burial ground, where fires could be kept burning to provide warmth during winter nights, where weapons could be stored and where multiple guards could coordinate their activities. The watch houses were more effective than individual family watches because they provided systematic coverage rather than sporadic observation, because the guards were paid professionals rather than exhausted family members, because the presence of a permanent structure signaled to resurrectionists that the cemetery was defended, and that attempting to work there involved significant risk. But watch houses required funding to build and to staff, required the cemetery or the parish or the families collectively to organise and to contribute money, required ongoing commitment that was difficult to sustain when immediate fear faded and when the costs became burdensome. Many watch houses that were built with great enthusiasm after particularly egregious body-snatching incidents fell into disuse within months or years as funding dried up or as attention shifted to other concerns, leaving cemeteries once again vulnerable to resurrection. The physical barriers placed on individual graves were more permanent, but were also more expensive and were therefore available primarily to families with resources to purchase them. The mortsafe was perhaps the most common protective device, an iron framework that was placed over the grave immediately after burial, and that was designed to prevent digging or to make it difficult enough that resurrectionists would abandon the attempt. The mortsafes came in various designs, some covering only the grave itself while others extended several feet beyond the grave's boundaries. Some made of heavy iron bars that would require tools and time to remove, while others were lighter frameworks that provided mainly psychological rather than physical deterrence. The mortsafes were rented rather than purchased in many cases, with families paying fees to use the device for several weeks after burial, after which the framework would be removed and would be used on another grave, the assumption being that bodies became less valuable as decomposition progressed, and that after a month or two the risk of resurrection declined to the point where protection was no longer necessary. The rental system made mortsafes accessible to families who could not afford to purchase them outright, but who could manage the rental fees for the critical period immediately after burial. The iron coffins represented a more permanent and more expensive form of protection. Coffins made entirely of iron, or with iron reinforcement that made them nearly impossible to break open without tools and time that resurrectionists would not risk spending in a cemetery. The iron coffins were heavy and expensive, were affordable only to wealthy families, represented the kind of elaborate protection that created the two-tier system where those with money could be confident their dead were safe, while those without money remained vulnerable. Some graves were protected by patent coffins, devices that incorporated locks or mechanisms designed to prevent opening that promised security through engineering rather than through simple mass of metal. The patent coffins were marketed with claims about their effectiveness, with testimonials from satisfied customers, with illustrations showing the mechanisms and explaining how they would defeat any attempt at resurrection. But the effectiveness varied, with some designs working well, while others were easily circumvented by experienced resurrectionists who learned the weaknesses and who could open supposedly secure coffins with minimal difficulty. The torpedo coffins represented perhaps the most extreme protective measure, devices that incorporated explosive charges or sharp blades designed to injure or kill anyone who attempted to open the coffin, that turned grave robbing into a potentially lethal activity. The torpedoes were controversial because they raised questions about whether it was legitimate to set lethal traps even for criminals, whether the protection of the dead justified potentially killing the living, whether such devices might accidentally harm cemetery workers or family members who had legitimate reasons to open graves. The legal status of torpedo coffins was unclear, and their actual deployment was rare, but they represented the desperation that some families felt about protecting their dead. The wealthy could combine multiple protective measures, could bury their dead in iron coffins within brick-lined graves covered by mortsafes and located in well-watched churchyards, could create layers of security that made resurrection nearly impossible. But this level of protection was available to only a small percentage of the population, to those who could afford the substantial costs, leaving the majority of the dead vulnerable to resurrection regardless of how much their families might wish to protect them. The parish burial grounds and pauper cemeteries where most working-class people were buried had minimal protection, had perhaps a single watchman who could not possibly monitor the entire ground effectively, had no mortsafes or iron coffins, buried people in wooden boxes that could be opened easily by resurrectionists with crowbars. The bodies in these grounds were harvested systematically, with resurrectionists working through them grave by grave, taking bodies almost as quickly as they were buried, creating a situation where burial in a pauper ground nearly guaranteed resurrection, unless the body was too diseased or too decomposed to be saleable. The community response to this inequality sometimes took violent forms. Groups of working-class men would organize patrols of their local cemeteries, would arm themselves and would wait for resurrectionists to appear, would attack them with clubs and stones, would beat them severely, would occasionally kill them, would express through violence the rage they felt about the violation of their dead and about the inability of the law to provide adequate protection. These attacks were generally not prosecuted, or were prosecuted only perfunctorily because magistrates and juries understood the provocation, understood that families were protecting their dead in the absence of legal remedies, understood that the violence, while regrettable, was understandable given the circumstances. The resurrectionists learned to work around the various protective measures, developed techniques for defeating mortsafes and for avoiding watchmen, learned which cemeteries had effective protection and which had only symbolic barriers that could be overcome with minimal effort. They adapted to the defences that families erected, became more sophisticated in their methods, worked in larger groups when necessary to overwhelm guards, bribed cemetery officials to provide information about which graves had protection and which were vulnerable, maintained the advantage that came from being organised professionals working against disorganised and under-resourced family efforts. The arms race between protection and resurrection continued throughout the 1820s, with families developing new protective measures, and with resurrectionists developing new techniques to defeat those measures, with neither side achieving permanent advantage, with the trade continuing because the fundamental problem remained unsolved. The law had not changed to provide adequate legal supply of bodies to anatomy schools. The demand continued to drive prices that made body snatching profitable. The resurrectionists continued to operate because the rewards outweighed the risks, and the families continued to fight back because the law would not fight for them. Some families gave up, accepted that they could not protect their dead, chose to bury their loved ones without elaborate protective measures, and simply hoped that the body would not be taken, or that if it was taken, the family would never discover the violation. This resignation was perhaps more common than the active resistance, reflected the exhaustion and the economic constraints that made sustained protection impossible for most families, reflected the understanding that the system would not change, and that individual families fighting alone would not prevail against organised professional criminals, who had the advantages of experience and of financial incentives that drove them to overcome whatever obstacles were placed in their way. The psychological toll of living with the knowledge that burial might not be permanent, that the dead might be stolen and sold, that the bodies of loved ones might end up on dissection tables, was significant and was reflected in the literature and the culture of the period. The horror stories and Gothic novels that flourished in early 19th century often featured themes of violated graves and returned dead, reflected anxieties about resurrection, both supernatural and criminal, gave expression to fear that were grounded in reality rather than in mere imagination. The families who discovered that their loved ones had been resurrected sometimes pursued the bodies, would go to anatomy schools and would demand their return, would create scenes that were emotionally wrenching and that sometimes resulted in the anatomists returning bodies that had not yet been dissected, or returning remains if dissection had already begun. But these recoveries were rare, and were generally possible only when families discovered the theft quickly and when they had enough social status to make demands that anatomists felt compelled to respect. Most resurrection went undiscovered until too late. Most bodies that were stolen were dissected and destroyed before families even knew they were gone. Most violations remained unpunished and unredressed. The fight to protect the dead would continue until the law changed, until the Anatomy Act of 1832 provided a legal alternative to grave robbing, until the economic incentives that drove resurrection were eliminated by making bodies available through legal means. But until that reform occurred, the families fought on as best they could, erected barriers and posted watches and sometimes resorted to violence, trying to protect their dead in a system that would not protect them, trying to preserve the dignity of burial when economic forces and legal failures had made that dignity impossible to guarantee. Chapter 6. The Price of Flesh. The economics of the resurrection trade were shaped by market forces that were as predictable and as rational as any legitimate business, with supply and demand determining prices, with seasonal variations affecting availability and cost, with quality and freshness commanding premiums, with the entire system operating according to principles that would have been familiar to any merchant trading in commodities, except that the commodity in this case was human bodies. The baseline price for a corpse in 1825 was approximately £8 for an adult body delivered fresh to an anatomy school in London or Edinburgh. This price represented the equilibrium point where supply and demand balanced, where enough resurrectionists were willing to do the work of grave robbing for that payment, and where anatomists were willing to pay that amount for the bodies they needed. The price had risen from perhaps £4 or £5 in the 1790s as demand had increased with the expansion of medical education, had stabilised around £8 by the 1820s, and would remain relatively stable until the Anatomy Act eliminated the market entirely. £8 was substantial money in early 19th century Britain, equivalent to perhaps 2 or 3 months' wages for an agricultural labourer, enough to support a working-class family for a significant period if spent carefully. A resurrectionist who could deliver 1 body per week would earn more than most skilled tradesmen would have income that placed him well above the poverty line despite engaging in work that was technically illegal and that was universally condemned. The economics made body snatching attractive to people who were willing to overcome moral scruples and physical revulsion in exchange for income that was difficult to obtain through legal employment. But the £8 baseline was just a starting point for negotiation that could vary considerably based on multiple factors. The season affected prices significantly, with winter bodies commanding lower prices because supply was more abundant due to higher death rates from respiratory diseases, and because cold weather preserved bodies longer, allowing resurrectionists more time to extract and deliver them. Summer bodies could sell for £12 or £15 because scarcity drove up demand and because heat meant bodies had to be obtained and delivered quickly before decomposition made them unusable, creating urgency that allowed resurrectionists to negotiate higher prices. The freshness of the body was perhaps the most important quality factor affecting price. A body that had been dead for less than 24 hours and that had been kept cool was worth more than one that had been dead for several days, was more valuable because it was more suitable for detailed dissection, because the tissues had not begun to break down, because students could learn more from examining structures that were still in good condition. The resurrectionists understood this and worked to minimize the time between death and delivery, would sometimes obtain bodies on the day of burial or the following day, would transport them immediately to anatomy schools, would negotiate premium prices for the freshest specimens. The size and condition of the body also affected value. Adult bodies were more valuable than children's bodies because they were more suitable for teaching anatomy to students who would be treating adult patients, because the structures were larger and easier to see and demonstrate. But children's bodies had their own market among anatomists who specialized in pediatric medicine, or who needed to demonstrate developmental differences, would sell for perhaps half what adult bodies commanded, but would still generate profit for resurrectionists who might obtain them more easily from pauper burial grounds where infant mortality was high. Bodies with unusual anatomical features could command premium prices if the features were of educational interest. A person who had died with a tumor or with a congenital deformity, or with some other pathological condition, might be worth significantly more than a normal body because anatomists could use such specimens to teach students about disease and abnormality, could preserve the organs in jars for long-term study, could build their reputations by acquiring and studying rare conditions. The resurrectionists sometimes learned about such cases through their networks of informants, would target specific graves knowing that the bodies would be particularly valuable, would negotiate aggressively with anatomists who competed for access to unusual specimens. The teeth of corpses had separate value and were sometimes removed by resurrectionists before delivering bodies to anatomists, were sold to dentists who would use them for making dentures for wealthy patients who had lost their own teeth. The trade in corpse teeth was substantial enough that some resurrectionists specialized in it, would remove teeth from bodies before selling the corpses, would double their income by selling both the body and the teeth as separate products. The anatomists generally accepted this practice because they had no use for the teeth, and because objecting might alienate the resurrectionists who could easily take their business to competing anatomy schools. The negotiation of prices occurred when bodies were delivered to anatomy schools, with the resurrectionist and the anatomist or his assistant examining the corpse and discussing what it was worth. The anatomist would assess freshness and condition, would point out any defects or problems that might reduce value, would make an offer that the resurrectionist could accept or reject. The resurrectionist would counter by emphasizing the quality and freshness, would mention that other anatomy schools might pay more, would try to extract the highest price possible. The negotiation was typically brief because both parties had experience and knew roughly what bodies should sell for, but there was always room for haggling at the margins. The payment was always in cash immediately upon agreement, with no documentation and no receipts. The anatomist would count out the money, would hand it to the resurrectionist, would take possession of the body, and the transaction would be complete. Neither party wanted records that could be used as evidence if investigations occurred. Neither party wanted their involvement documented in ways that could be examined later. Both parties benefited from the transaction being untraceable and deniable. The resurrectionists divided the money according to whatever arrangements they had made among themselves, with the person who had organized the job typically taking a larger share and with the others splitting the remainder. The division was sometimes a source of conflict within gangs, with arguments about who had done the most work or who had taken the most risk, with the potential for violence if someone felt they'd been cheated. But most gangs had established procedures for splitting money, had hierarchies that determined shares, had norms that were generally respected because the ongoing nature of the work meant that maintaining good relationships was important for continued profitability. The money was spent quickly in most cases, was used for immediate needs and pleasures, rather than being saved for future security. The resurrectionists lived day to day or week to week, enjoyed their earnings while they had them, understood that the risks of their trade meant that planning too far ahead was pointless because arrest or injury or death could end the income stream at any moment. The taverns and gambling houses near anatomy schools did substantial business with resurrectionists who had just been paid, who had money burning in their pockets, who spent liberally because they expected to earn more soon. The total volume of the resurrection trade in economic terms was substantial. If the London anatomy schools alone needed 600 bodies annually at an average price of £8, that represented £4,800 circulating through the resurrection trade each year just in London, with similar though smaller amounts in Edinburgh and in other cities with medical schools. The accumulated total across Britain might have been £8,000 or £10,000 annually, a significant underground economy that operated entirely outside legal channels, that was untaxed and unregulated, that enriched resurrectionists and anatomists while requiring grave robbing and desecration of the dead. The anatomists who purchased bodies justified the prices they paid as necessary expenses of medical education, as costs that had to be borne if students were to receive adequate training. They passed those costs on to students through the fees charged for anatomy courses, through the charges for access to dissection facilities, through the overall expense of medical education that was high, partly because the illegal procurement of bodies was expensive. The students paid these fees, understanding that they were funding grave robbing even if that funding was indirect and even if it was never explicitly acknowledged. The profits that some anatomists made from their schools were substantial, with successful operators like Joshua Brooks in London earning thousands of pounds annually from student fees, living well from income derived ultimately from the resurrection trade. The anatomists maintained respectable public images, lived in good neighbourhoods, associated with the social and professional elite, presented themselves as men of science and learning, but their prosperity was built on foundation of violated graves and purchased corpses, was tainted by the criminal enterprise that supplied them with the materials necessary for their business. The corruption that sustained the market extended beyond the direct transaction between resurrectionists and anatomists. Cemetery officials who accepted bribes to provide information about burials, constables who were paid to ignore suspicious activity, magistrates who imposed minimal sentences when resurrectionists were convicted. All of these participants took their cuts from the economics of the resurrection trade. All benefited financially from the system that violated graves and that desecrated the dead for profit. The market also included peripheral participants who provided services necessary for the trade. The carters who transported bodies, the operators of safe houses where corpses could be stored temporarily, the informants who provided intelligence about funerals and burials, all of these people earned money from the resurrection trade. All had economic incentives to help it continue. All participated in the system, even if they never touched a spade or never negotiated directly with anatomists. The economics of the trade would remain stable and profitable until the legal framework changed, until the Anatomy Act of 1832 eliminated the market by providing legal alternative supply of bodies, until the price of corpses collapsed, because anatomists could obtain them through legal means, and therefore had no reason to pay resurrectionists the premiums that had made grave robbing profitable. The trade that had enriched resurrectionists for decades would disappear almost overnight when the law changed, when the market forces that had sustained it were redirected toward legal procurement, when economic incentives no longer drove people to rob graves because the demand had been met through other channels. But until that change occurred, the price of flesh remained stable and substantial, remained high enough to attract people willing to do the work, remained the foundation of an economy built on crime and corruption, remained the measure of how much British society was willing to pay, both financially and morally, for medical education that depended on bodies obtained through means that everyone condemned publicly, but that everyone involved facilitated privately. Chapter 7. Burke and Hare. The evolution from grave robbing to murder was perhaps inevitable given the economics of the resurrection trade, given that killing produced fresh bodies more reliably than grave robbing did, given that the anatomists asked no questions about where bodies came from or how they had been obtained, given that the market rewarded freshness above all else, and that the freshest possible body was one that had been alive until moments before delivery. The transition from resurrection to murder occurred most famously in Edinburgh in 1827 and 1828, in a lodging house operated by William Hare and his wife Margaret, in crimes committed by Hare and by his friend William Burke, in a series of killings that would eventually total 16 victims that would shock Britain when they were discovered, that would finally force the legal reform that had been needed for decades but that had been politically impossible until scandal made inaction intolerable. William Burke was an Irish immigrant who had come to Scotland seeking work, who had moved through various labouring jobs, who had ended up in Edinburgh in the mid-1820s with his common-law wife Helen MacDougall, living in circumstances that were precarious, that provided just enough to survive but that offered no security and no prospect of improvement. He was 40 years old in 1827, was illiterate, was neither particularly intelligent nor particularly stupid, was simply an ordinary man trying to get by in a city where opportunities for unskilled labourers were limited, and where poverty was common and where desperation drove people to actions they might not otherwise have considered. William Hare was similarly Irish, similarly poor, similarly living at the margins of Edinburgh society. He operated a lodging house in the West Port, one of the poorest areas of the city, a place where rooms were rented by the night to labourers and to people passing through, where the accommodations were minimal and the clientele was transient, where no one asked questions about other residents and where people came and went without attracting notice. The lodging house provided Hare with modest income that was supplemented by his wife Margaret's work and by whatever other opportunities presented themselves. Burke and Hare became friends, or at least associates through proximity and shared background, would drink together, would help each other with odd jobs, would spend time in the casual socialising that characterised life in Edinburgh's working-class neighbourhoods. Neither had criminal records beyond minor offences, neither was known to police as particularly dangerous or problematic, neither would have attracted attention as someone likely to become a serial killer. They were ordinary men living ordinary lives of quiet desperation until circumstances and opportunity aligned in ways that transformed them into murderers. Their first death occurred in November 1827, when a lodger named Donald died of natural causes in Hare's establishment, died owing rent that Hare could not collect from a dead man, died creating problem of what to do with the body. Hare knew that bodies had value, knew that the anatomy schools paid for corpses, saw opportunity to recover the lost rent and perhaps to make additional money by selling Donald's body rather than arranging for burial that would cost money. Hare did not want to spend. Hare approached Burke with the idea of selling the body, proposed that they work together to deliver it to one of the anatomy schools, suggested they split whatever payment they received. Burke agreed, perhaps out of friendship or perhaps because he also needed money, perhaps without fully thinking through the implications of what they were about to do. The two men removed Donald's body from the coffin that had been provided for burial, replaced it with bark to give the coffin appropriate weight, buried the bark, and transported the body to Surgeons Square, where they approached a Robert Knox, one of Edinburgh's most prominent anatomists, a man who operated a successful private anatomy school and who was always in need of bodies for his students. Knox examined the body, noted its freshness, agreed to purchase it for £7 10 shillings, paid in cash, asked no questions about where it had come from or how it had been obtained. The transaction took only minutes, was conducted with the same casualness that characterised legitimate commerce, was completed without any indication from Knox that he suspected anything unusual about how Burke and Hare had obtained the body. The money was more than either man had seen in months, was earned through perhaps an hour's work, was obtained without the risk and labour that grave robbing would have required. The lesson was obvious and was not lost on Burke and Hare. Bodies were valuable. Knox would buy them without questions. The work of obtaining them could be much easier than grave robbing if one did not wait for natural death, but instead produced bodies through murder. The reasoning was simple and terrible, was the kind of logic that emerges when economic incentives overwhelm moral constraints, when desperation and opportunity combine in ways that make the unthinkable seem practical. The second victim was a miller named Joseph who lodged at Hare's establishment in February 1828, who fell ill with a fever, who was killed by Burke and Hare, who smothered him with a pillow, who was sold to Knox for £10. The method they used, suffocation through smothering, left no obvious marks of violence, produced bodies that appeared to have died naturally, that anatomists would not question because there was no visible evidence of murder. The technique would become their standard method, would be used for all subsequent victims, would be refined through practice until they could kill quickly and efficiently without leaving traces that would raise suspicions. The murders continued through the spring and summer and fall of 1828, accelerating in frequency as Burke and Hare grew more confident and as the money they earned became addictive, as the ease of the work and the substantial payments made it difficult to stop. They targeted people who would not be missed, who had no families or close connections, who were transient or were social outcasts, who could disappear without generating inquiries or investigations. They lured victims to Hare's lodging house with offers of drink or shelter, would get them intoxicated, would kill them when they were incapacitated, would deliver the bodies to Knox usually within hours of death, would collect payment and would begin looking for the next victim. The victims included Mary Patterson, a young prostitute who was killed in April, whose body was so fresh and so recognizable when delivered to Knox that students who had known her alive identified her on the dissection table, who generated the first serious questions about whether Knox was receiving murdered bodies rather than resurrected ones. Knox dismissed the concerns, proceeded with the dissection, paid Burke and Hare, maintained the pretense that he did not know and did not want to know where the bodies came from. Other victims followed. Through the summer and fall, an old woman named Effie, another woman named Anne, a young deaf-mute boy named James, an elderly woman named Mary Haldane and her daughter Peggy, each murdered for the £8 or £10 their bodies would bring, each delivered fresh to Knox who paid and asked no questions, each dissected and destroyed within days of being killed, each death contributing to Burke and Hare's income and to Knox's supply of teaching materials. The final victim was Margaret Docherty, killed on October the 31st, 1828, murdered in circumstances that were witnessed indirectly by other lodgers at Hare's establishment, lodgers who became suspicious when the woman disappeared and when Burke and Hare were evasive about what had happened to her. The lodgers searched and found the body hidden under straw in a bed, found clear evidence that murder had occurred, fled the house and reported what they had seen to police, who arrested Burke and Hare and their wives on November 1st. The investigation that followed was intensive and was complicated by the fact that the bodies of most victims had been dissected and destroyed, that physical evidence of murder was limited to testimony and circumstantial connections. Hare was offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for testifying against Burke, accepted the deal, provided detailed confession about all 16 murders, described the methods and the motives and the transactions with Knox. Burke maintained his innocence initially, but eventually confessed after Hare's testimony made denial pointless, provided his own account that largely corroborated Hare's version of events. The trial of William Burke began on Christmas Eve 1828, lasted one day, resulted in conviction on December the 25th. He was sentenced to death by hanging and to subsequent public dissection, the same punishment that had been reserved for murderers, but that took on additional irony given that Burke had killed to supply bodies for dissection. The sentence was carried out on January 28, 1829, before a crowd estimated at 25,000 people, one of the largest public executions in Edinburgh's history, attended by people who wanted to see justice done, and who wanted to witness the end of the man who had murdered for profit. Burke's body was publicly dissected at the Anatomy Theatre of Professor Alexander Monro, was subjected to the same treatment that Burke had inflicted on his victims, was reduced to anatomical specimen in process that was meant to be educational, but that was also clearly punitive, that demonstrated what happened to those who murdered. The skeleton was preserved and is still on display at the Anatomical Museum of the University of Edinburgh, a permanent reminder of the crimes and of the trade that had made them profitable. William Hare was released after testifying, was given safe passage out of Edinburgh, disappeared into obscurity, was rumoured to have been killed by a mob in England or to have died a beggar in London, but may simply have changed his name and lived out his days anonymously. Helen MacDougall, Burke's wife, was tried but acquitted due to insufficient evidence, disappeared after the trial. Margaret Hare was never charged, faded from the historical record. Dr. Robert Knox was never prosecuted despite clear evidence that he had purchased bodies from Burke and Hare, despite his students' concerns about the freshness and the suspicious circumstances of some deliveries, despite the obvious questions about whether he had known or should have known that he was buying murdered victims. Knox maintained that he had asked no questions and therefore bore no responsibility, claimed that anatomists could not be expected to investigate the provenance of every body they purchased, insisted that he had acted in good faith even though that faith required extraordinary willful blindness. The public outrage against Knox was intense and sustained, destroyed his medical practice, forced him eventually to leave Edinburgh, ruined his career despite his never being formally charged with any crime. The scandal that his association with Burke and Hare created made it impossible for him to continue as an anatomist, drove students away from his school, made him a pariah in medical and social circles. He died in 1862, his reputation never recovered, remembered not for his anatomical expertise, but for his role in the Burke and Hare murders. The Burke and Hare case demonstrated what the resurrection trade had been heading toward, showed that the market for bodies created incentives that led logically from grave robbing to murder, proved that anatomists who asked no questions would buy murdered victims as readily as they bought resurrected corpses, revealed the moral bankruptcy of a system that depended on crime and that rewarded it so well that killing became economically rational. The scandal would finally force the legal reform that had been needed for decades, would make continuation of the old system politically impossible, would lead directly to the Anatomy Act of 1832 that would transform how bodies were obtained for medical education. Chapter 8. The London Burkers. The horror of the Burke and Hare murders might have been dismissed as an isolated aberration, as the actions of uniquely depraved individuals operating in specific circumstances that were unlikely to be replicated elsewhere, except that within 3 years of Burke's execution, London experienced its own murder for dissection scandal, a case that proved the Edinburgh crimes had not been anomalies, but were instead logical outcomes of a system that rewarded fresh bodies without asking how freshness had been achieved. The London murders were committed by John Bishop, Thomas Williams, and James May, men who operated as professional resurrectionists in the early 1830s, who'd been in the body-snatching trade for years, who understood the market and the anatomists and the techniques that made grave robbing profitable. They were not desperate amateurs like Burke and Hare had been, but were experienced criminals who made calculated decision that murder was more efficient than resurrection, that killing produced better product with less labour, that the risks were manageable as long as they were careful about victim selection and about maintaining the appearance that bodies had died naturally. Bishop was perhaps 40 years old in 1831, had been a resurrectionist for more than a decade, had established relationships with multiple anatomy schools in London, was known as a reliable supplier of good quality bodies. He worked with a small group of associates including Williams and May, operated from a house in Nova Scotia Gardens in Bethnal Green, a working class area in East London, where his activities did not attract unusual attention, where comings and goings at odd hours were common enough that neighbours did not particularly notice or care what Bishop and his associates were doing. The gang had been grave robbing successfully for years, had developed efficient methods for identifying and opening graves, had networks of informants who could provide intelligence about recent burials, had relationships with anatomists who would purchase whatever bodies they delivered. But grave robbing was labour-intensive and was becoming more difficult as cemetery security improved, as more families used protective devices, as public awareness of the resurrection trade made people more vigilant about protecting their dead. The economics were pushing resurrectionists toward murder just as they had pushed Burke and Hare, creating incentives that overwhelmed whatever moral constraints might otherwise have prevented the transition from theft to killing. The first murder that can be definitively attributed to Bishop's gang occurred in late 1831, though it is likely there were earlier victims whose deaths were never connected to the resurrectionists, whose bodies were sold and dissected and destroyed without anyone realizing they had been murdered. The victim whose death would eventually expose the gang was a boy known as the Italian Boy, a child of perhaps 14, who made his living showing white mice on London streets, who was one of many poor children who survived through begging and small entertainments, who was vulnerable precisely because he was alone and friendless, and because his disappearance would generate no immediate concern. The boy was encountered by Bishop and Williams on the evening of November 3rd, 1831 in the area around Smithfield Market, was lured to Bishop's house in Nova Scotia Gardens with promises of food or shelter or money, was given drink laced with laudanum that rendered him unconscious, was then murdered through a method that Bishop and Williams had apparently developed through practice. The technique involved forcing the head back and compressing the chest simultaneously, producing death through a combination of spinal damage and asphyxiation, leaving minimal external marks that might raise suspicions when the body was delivered to anatomists. The body was placed in a trunk and was taken the following morning to King's College Anatomy School, where Bishop and Williams attempted to sell it to the Demonstrator of Anatomy, a position held by Richard Partridge, who was responsible for acquiring bodies for student dissection. Partridge examined the body, noted its exceptional freshness, noted also that the boy appeared well nourished rather than having the wasted appearance of someone who had died from disease, noted that there were suspicious marks on the back and suspicious freshness of blood in the mouth that suggested violence rather than natural death. Partridge's suspicions were heightened by the fact that the body was clearly that of a child of perhaps 12 to 14 years, that children's bodies were less common in the resurrection trade, and therefore more suspicious when they appeared, that the condition of the body suggested it had been alive very recently, perhaps within the previous 12 hours. He stalled Bishop and Williams, told them he needed to consult with colleagues about the price, asked them to return later in the day, and meanwhile sent word to the police that he had been offered a body under circumstances that seemed suspicious. The police arrived at King's College before Bishop and Williams returned, examined the body, agreed that the circumstances were highly suspicious, agreed to a plan where the resurrectionists would be allowed to complete the transaction and would then be arrested. When Bishop and Williams returned that afternoon, expecting to collect payment for the body, they were instead taken into custody, were searched and were found to be carrying items that suggested they'd been involved in resurrection or murder, including implements that could be used for opening graves or for subduing victims. The subsequent investigation moved quickly, with police searching Bishop's house in Nova Scotia Gardens, finding evidence that multiple bodies had been processed there, finding surgical tools and containers that suggested the premises had been used for preparing corpses for sale, finding enough circumstantial evidence to support charges not just for this single murder, but potentially for others. James May was arrested as an associate of Bishop and Williams, though his direct involvement in the murder was less clear than that of the other two men. The interrogation of the suspects produced confession from Bishop, who admitted to the murder of the Italian boy, and to two other previous murders, a boy named Cunningham and a woman named Fanny Pigburn, victims who had been killed using similar methods and whose bodies had been sold to various anatomy schools around London. Bishop's confession was detailed and was apparently genuine, was motivated partly by hope for leniency and partly perhaps by desire to unburden himself of knowledge that had become psychologically difficult to carry. Williams confessed to participation in the murders, though he attempted to minimize his role, suggested he had been following Bishop's lead, claimed he had not realized initially that they were committing murder, rather than simply acquiring bodies through some other means. The trial of Bishop, Williams and May began on December 2, 1831 at the Old Bailey, attracted enormous public attention, was covered extensively by newspapers that sensationalized the crimes, that drew explicit parallels to Burke and Hare, that characterized the defendants as Burkers, and that created panic about how many bodies on dissection tables across London might have been murder victims rather than resurrected corpses. The prosecution presented evidence about the Italian boy's murder, presented Bishop's confession, presented expert testimony from anatomists who had examined the body and who confirmed that the injuries were consistent with the methods Bishop described, presented overwhelming case that murder for dissection had occurred. The defence was perfunctory, offered little beyond arguments that the confessions had been coerced and that the evidence was circumstantial, arguments that carried little weight given the detailed nature of Bishop's admissions and given the physical evidence that supported the prosecution's case. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning guilty verdicts against Bishop and Williams, found May not guilty due to insufficient evidence of his direct involvement in the murder, though he was clearly involved in the resurrection trade and had likely known about the murders, even if he had not participated directly. Bishop and Williams were sentenced to death and to subsequent dissection, the same punishment that had been applied to Burke, the same ironic justice that turned murderers who had killed for dissection into subjects for dissection themselves. These sentences were carried out on December 5, 1831, before a crowd estimated at 30,000 people, one of the largest gatherings for an execution that London had seen, attended by people who were horrified by the murders and who wanted to see justice done, who wanted to witness the end of men who had violated fundamental taboos about the sanctity of human life. The bodies of Bishop and Williams were delivered to anatomy schools as the sentences required, were publicly dissected in demonstrations that were well attended, that served educational purposes, but that also served as public spectacle and as warning about the consequences of murder. The skeleton of John Bishop was preserved and eventually ended up in museum collections where it remains, another permanent reminder of the murder for dissection trade and of the men who had engaged in it. The London Burke case created panic that went beyond the specific crimes that had been prosecuted, generated questions about how many other murders might have occurred, how many bodies that had been sold to anatomy schools over the previous years might have been murder victims whose deaths had never been detected. The anatomists were pressed to explain how they could not have known they were purchasing murdered bodies, how the freshness and condition of corpses delivered by resurrectionists had not raised questions, how they could claim ignorance when the evidence suggested willful blindness at minimum and possible complicity at worst. The anatomical profession's response was defensive and was largely unconvincing to a public that was already predisposed to believe the worst about men who made their living cutting up the dead. The anatomists insisted they had no way to distinguish between murdered bodies and bodies that had died naturally, claimed that freshness was desirable and was therefore not in itself suspicious, maintained that it was not their responsibility to investigate the provenance of bodies they purchased. But these arguments rang hollow when the bodies in question were children or were adults who showed signs of having been healthy immediately before death, when the circumstances of delivery were suspicious, when the resurrectionists who supplied bodies were known criminals who had been arrested multiple times for grave robbing. Some anatomists argued that they had in fact been suspicious about some deliveries, that they had refused bodies that seemed too fresh or that came from sources they did not trust, that they had taken precautions to avoid purchasing murdered victims. But these claims were difficult to verify and were contradicted by the evidence that Bishop and Williams had been selling bodies to multiple anatomy schools for an extended period without anyone raising alarms that resulted in investigation, that the market for bodies had functioned smoothly even when some of those bodies were almost certainly murder victims. The scandal accelerated the political movement toward legal reform that had been building since the Burke and Hare case, made it impossible for Parliament to continue ignoring the problem of how bodies were obtained for medical education, created consensus that the existing system was morally bankrupt and legally untenable. The public outcry demanded change, demanded that grave robbing be made more seriously criminal, demanded that anatomists be held accountable for the bodies they purchased, demanded that alternative legal sources of cadavers be identified, so that murder for dissection would no longer be economically rational. The Anatomy Act that would pass in 1832 as direct result of the Burke and Hare and London Burqa scandals was legislation that would not have been politically possible without the horror that those cases generated, that required the shock of murder for dissection to overcome the resistance to reform that had prevented change for decades. The Act would transform how bodies were obtained for medical education, would eliminate the resurrection trade by making bodies available through legal means, would end the era of grave robbing and murder for anatomy that had characterized British medical education for more than half a century. But the London Burqa case also raised questions that were never adequately answered. Questions about how many murders had occurred before Bishop and Williams were caught, how many bodies that had been dissected in anatomy schools across Britain had been victims of murder rather than of natural death, how many resurrectionists had made the same calculation that killing was easier than grave robbing and had acted on that calculation without being detected. The true scope of murder for dissection would never be known, was buried along with the victims whose bodies had been reduced to anatomical specimens, was hidden in the destroyed records and the lost memories of a trade that had operated in shadows and that had left few traces beyond the occasional spectacular prosecution. Chapter 9, The Anatomy Act of 1830. The legislative process that produced the Anatomy Act of 1832 was lengthy and contentious, was shaped by competing interests and by the political realities of early Victorian Britain, was driven ultimately by scandal and by the recognition that the existing system was unsustainable, but was also delayed by resistance from various groups who feared the consequences of reform. The first serious attempt at anatomical reform legislation had come in 1829, shortly after the Burke execution, but before the London Burqa case had demonstrated that murder for dissection was not confined to Edinburgh. The bill proposed by Henry Warburton, a member of Parliament who had been advocating for reform for years, would have allowed anatomists to claim bodies of people who died in workhouses and hospitals if those bodies were not claimed by family members within a specified period, would have created a legal pipeline of cadavers that would theoretically eliminate the need for grave robbing by providing adequate supply through legitimate means. The 1829 bill faced immediate and intense opposition from multiple directions. The poor feared that reform would make their bodies legally available for dissection in ways that the wealthy would escape, that dying in a workhouse would carry additional indignity beyond the poverty and degradation that had characterized their lives. The Church opposed the bill on religious grounds, argued that dissection interfered with Christian burial, and with the resurrection of the body insisted that only criminals should be subject to anatomization. The medical establishment was divided, with some anatomists supporting reform because it would legitimize their supply, while others worried that legal regulation might impose restrictions that would be worse than the existing unregulated system. The 1829 bill failed to pass, was defeated by combination of these various oppositions, demonstrated that reform was politically difficult despite the obvious problems with the existing system. But the London Burqa case in 1831 changed the political calculus, made inaction more costly than action, created an environment where opposition to reform could be characterised as supporting murder for dissection, as protecting a system that had produced the Burke and Hare and Bishop and Williams cases. The bill that was reintroduced in 1832 benefited from the momentum that scandal had created, from the public demand for change, from the recognition among political leaders that something had to be done to address a system that everyone acknowledged was producing unconscionable results. The debate in Parliament was extensive and was at times heated, with opponents of the bill making arguments that were both principled and self-interested, with supporters pressing the case that reform was necessary regardless of the objections, with the outcome never entirely certain until the final votes were counted. The core provision of the Anatomy Act as finally passed was that bodies of people who died in workhouses, hospitals and other public institutions could be claimed for anatomical dissection if they were not claimed by family members for burial within 48 hours of death. The bodies would be provided to licensed anatomy schools that would be regulated by inspectors who would ensure proper treatment of corpses and who would oversee the entire process from acquisition through dissection through eventual burial of remains. The Act also increased penalties for unauthorized dissection and for grave robbing, made those activities more seriously criminal than they had been under previous law, created framework that was intended to eliminate the resurrection trade by removing the economic incentives that had sustained it. The Act represented compromise between various interests, satisfied no one entirely but was acceptable enough to enough constituencies that it could pass. The anatomists gained legal access to bodies in quantities that would meet their needs, gained legitimacy and regulatory oversight that would protect them from accusations of complicity in grave robbing or murder. The workhouses gained mechanism for disposing of unclaimed bodies that had previously been buried at public expense, realised small financial benefit from reducing burial costs. The public gained assurance that the resurrection trade would be eliminated, that graves would no longer be violated, that murder for dissection would no longer be economically viable. But the Act also imposed costs that fell disproportionately on the poor, created exactly the two-tier system that opponents had warned about, made poverty and death as in life a source of additional indignity and exploitation. The wealthy could still ensure that their bodies and their family members' bodies would not be dissected because they could afford private burials, could ensure that bodies were claimed promptly, could avoid the workhouses and public hospitals where death would make one vulnerable to anatomization. The poor who died in public institutions, who had no families to claim them or whose families could not afford burial, would be taken for dissection as a kind of additional punishment for poverty, would be used for anatomical education in ways that explicitly recalled the use of executed criminals' bodies that had been the original legal source for dissection. The religious objections to the Act focused on this inequality and on the violation of the principle that Christian burial should be available to all regardless of economic status, that the poor should not be treated differently in death than the wealthy, that dissection should remain reserved for criminals rather than being extended to anyone who died without means. These objections were genuine and were grounded in theology and in social justice concerns, but they were ultimately overcome by the utilitarian argument that medical education required bodies and that legal access to unclaimed bodies from public institutions was the least harmful way to provide that access. The implementation of the Anatomy Act was gradual and was not without problems. The licensing system for anatomy schools took time to establish, required anatomists to apply for licenses and to submit to inspections, imposed regulatory burdens that some resented, but that most accepted as reasonable price for legal supply of bodies. The inspectors who were appointed to oversee the system varied in their diligence and their interpretation of the regulations, with some being strict and others being more permissive, with the resulting inconsistency creating confusion about exactly what was permitted and what was prohibited. The supply of bodies under the new system proved adequate to meet the needs of anatomy schools, vindicated the reformers' argument that legal provision could eliminate the need for grave robbing. The workhouses and hospitals that were required to make unclaimed bodies available did so with varying degrees of cooperation, with some institutions implementing the requirements efficiently, while others resisted or complied only minimally. but the overall effect was that anatomists had access to sufficient cadavers through legal means that the prices they had previously paid to resurrectionists could be eliminated or reduced, that the entire economics of body procurement changed in ways that made grave robbing unprofitable. The resurrection trade collapsed almost immediately after the Anatomy Act took effect. The resurrectionists who had made their livings robbing graves found that anatomists were no longer willing to purchase bodies illegally when they could obtain them legally, found that the market for stolen corpses had disappeared, found that their specialized skills were suddenly worthless. Some former resurrectionists tried to continue in the trade briefly, discovered that there were no buyers, gave up and moved to other criminal activities or to legitimate employment if they could find it. Others simply disappeared from the historical record, their fates unknown, their careers ended by legislative change that eliminated the demand that had sustained their work. The public response to the Anatomy Act was mixed. Those who had feared grave robbing were relieved that the trade had ended, that graves would no longer be violated, that burial would be permanent. But those who objected to the use of pauper bodies for dissection continued to protest, organize campaigns against the act, attempted to generate political pressure for its repeal or modification. These campaigns were ultimately unsuccessful because the alternative to the act was return to the resurrection trade with all its attendant problems, because political leaders were unwilling to recreate conditions that had produced the Burke and Hare and London burqa scandals, because the medical establishment strongly supported the new system and had political influence that opponents could not match. The long-term effect of the Anatomy Act was to normalise the use of unclaimed bodies for medical education, to create a system that persisted with modifications for more than a century, to establish principle that the bodies of the poor could be used for purposes that served the public good, even when the individuals had not consented, and even when their families objected. The ethical questions raised by this system, questions about consent and dignity and the treatment of the vulnerable, would continue to be debated, but would not prevent the system from functioning largely as designed, would not protect the poor from being used in death in ways that the wealthy could avoid. The Act also changed the culture of anatomy, made it a legitimate and regulated profession, rather than an activity that depended on crime and that operated in legal and moral twilight. The anatomists who had previously purchased bodies from resurrectionists and who had maintained willful ignorance about how those bodies were obtained could now claim that their work was entirely legal and proper, that they were operating under government license and government oversight, that they bore no taint from association with grave robbing or murder. The transformation was rapid and was largely successful in rehabilitating the reputation of anatomy and in allowing medical education to proceed without the scandals that had characterized the Resurrection era. But the Anatomy Act could not undo what had already occurred, could not restore the bodies that had been stolen from graves over the decades of resurrection trade, could not bring justice to the murder victims who had been killed to supply anatomists with fresh cadavers, could not erase the suffering and the violations that had been necessary to build the anatomical knowledge that benefited subsequent generations. The Act addressed the future but left the past unresolved, left questions unanswered about how many graves had been robbed, how many murders had been committed, how many anatomists had been complicit in crimes they claimed not to have known about. The reform that came in 1832 was necessary and was overdue, eliminated a system that had been morally indefensible, provided legal framework that allowed medical education to continue without depending on crime. But the reform also demonstrated how long injustice can persist when it serves powerful interests, how much suffering must accumulate before political will develops to address obvious problems, how the costs of delayed reform are borne disproportionately by those with least power to protect themselves. Chapter 10. The Legacy of the Resurrectionists. The resurrection trade ended in 1832 with the passage of the Anatomy Act, but its legacy persisted in ways both obvious and subtle, in the medical knowledge that had been built on foundation of violated graves, in the ethical questions that continued to trouble those who thought seriously about how anatomical science had developed, in the cultural memory of an era when the dead were not safe and when burial was not final. The most immediate and tangible legacy was the anatomical knowledge itself, the detailed understanding of human structure and function that had been developed through decades of dissection, that had been impossible to acquire through study of ancient texts or through limited access to executed criminals' bodies, that had required the systematic examination of hundreds or thousands of cadavers obtained primarily through grave robbing. The anatomy textbooks that were published in the early 19th century, the illustrations that showed muscles and organs and blood vessels in precise detail, the teaching that allowed surgeons to perform complex operations with confidence in their knowledge of what lay beneath the skin, all of this was built on bodies that had been stolen. The ethical question that this raised was whether knowledge obtained through immoral means was tainted, whether the benefits of that knowledge could justify the methods used to acquire it, whether using anatomical information derived from resurrected bodies made one complicit in the grave robbing that had produced those bodies. The medical profession generally avoided these questions, maintained that knowledge once acquired had value independent of how it had been obtained, argued that refusing to use anatomical information would not restore the violated graves but would only ensure that the suffering had been for nothing, that the bodies had been stolen and desecrated without even the compensation of advancing medical science. But the ethical concerns persisted, particularly among those who took seriously the principle that the ends do not justify the means, that how knowledge is obtained matters as much as the knowledge itself, that using information derived from grave robbing perpetuated the violation by giving it continuing purpose and value. These critics argued that anatomy should acknowledge its dark history rather than burying it, should grapple honestly with the fact that medical progress had been built on crime and exploitation, should consider what obligations the profession had to those whose bodies had been used without consent and whose suffering had enabled advances that benefited others. The cultural legacy of the resurrection trade appeared in literature and popular culture in ways that reflected anxieties about death and burial that the era had intensified. The Gothic novels of the early 19th century featured resurrectionist characters and plots involving violated graves and stolen bodies, gave literary form to fears that were grounded in reality. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, published in 1818, drew explicitly on resurrection imagery, featured a protagonist who assembled his creature from parts of corpses that had presumably been obtained through grave robbing, explored themes about the ethics of using the dead for scientific purposes that resonated with contemporary concerns about the anatomy trade. The vocabulary that entered common usage during the resurrection era persisted long after the trade itself ended. The term burking, meaning to murder by suffocation, became standard English, was used to describe not just the specific method that Burke and Hare had employed, but any killing done quietly and secretly. The phrase body snatchers remained in popular consciousness, was applied metaphorically to anyone who exploited the vulnerable, became cultural shorthand for a particular kind of mercenary criminality that violated fundamental taboos. The physical remnants of the resurrection trade survived in various forms. The mortsafes and iron coffins and watchtowers that had been erected to protect graves remained in cemeteries across Britain, became historical curiosities, were preserved in some cases as reminders of an era when the dead needed protection that the law would not provide. The skeletons of Burke and of Bishop that had been preserved after their executions remained on display in medical museums, served as educational tools but also as moral lessons about the consequences of murder for dissection. The documentary evidence of the trade, the trial records and the newspaper accounts, and the occasional mentions in anatomists' correspondence and in medical school records provided historians with materials for reconstructing what had occurred, for understanding the scale and the mechanics and the human cost of the resurrection trade. But the documentary record was incomplete and was biased toward the spectacular cases that resulted in prosecutions, toward the Burke and Hare and London Burqa, scandals that generated extensive coverage while the routine grave robbing that occurred daily across Britain for decades left fewer traces, was documented inadequately if at all. The question of how many graves were robbed during the Resurrection era has no definitive answer, but estimates based on the number of bodies that anatomy schools required suggest the total was in the tens of thousands, possibly approaching 100,000 bodies stolen over the roughly 80 years from the mid-18th century to 1832. Each of those thefts represented a family's grief compounded by violation, represented a person whose rest was disturbed, represented a crime that went largely unpunished because the law categorized body snatching as a minor offense, and because the system depended on the trade continuing. The number of murders committed for dissection is even more difficult to estimate because most were never detected, never prosecuted, never documented except in the memories of killers and in the suspicions of anatomists who chose not to ask questions that might produce uncomfortable answers. Burke and Hare killed 16 people. Bishop and Williams confessed to 3 murders but likely committed more. How many other resurrectionists made the same transition from grave robbing to murder? How many bodies that were sold as fresh corpses were actually murder victims whose deaths were disguised as natural? The true number will never be known, but was almost certainly larger than the handful of cases that resulted in convictions. The anatomists who purchased bodies during the Resurrection era carried responsibility that most refused to acknowledge, maintained fictions about their ignorance of how bodies were obtained that protected them from prosecution, but that did not absolve them of moral culpability. The system worked because anatomists created demand and provided payment and asked no questions, because they chose profit and professional advancement over ethical concerns about grave robbing and murder, because they convinced themselves that medical progress justified methods that violated fundamental principles about respect for the dead and about consent. The reform that came with the Anatomy Act addressed the practical problem of body supply, but did not address the underlying ethical issues about using bodies without consent. Simply transferred the exploitation from grave robbing to legal appropriation of pauper corpses, from criminal theft to state-sanctioned taking. The poor who died in workhouses after 1832 had no more choice about what happened to their bodies than did those who were resurrected before the Act, were used for dissection without consent just as surely as the victims of grave robbing had been. Experienced violation that was legal, but that was not necessarily more ethical for being authorised by Parliament. The long-term trajectory of anatomical ethics would eventually move toward consent-based systems, toward requirements that bodies used for medical education and research be donated voluntarily by people who understood and agreed to how their remains would be used, toward recognition that respect for persons extends beyond death, and that using bodies requires permission that cannot be assumed or coerced. But this evolution took more than a century, required social and legal changes that came slowly, required the medical profession to acknowledge obligations that the Resurrection era had taught them to ignore. The legacy of the resurrectionists includes the uncomfortable truth that medical progress has often been built on exploitation of the vulnerable, that the history of medicine is not simply a history of scientific advancement and humanitarian service, but also a history of using people without consent, of prioritizing knowledge over dignity, of allowing ends to justify means in ways that subsequent generations recognized as wrong, but that were defended by their contemporaries as necessary. The resurrection trade was a particularly egregious example of this pattern, but was not unique. It was part of a longer history of medical experimentation and education that treated some people as means to ends rather than as ends in themselves. The story of the resurrection men is ultimately a story about what happens when economic incentives are allowed to override moral constraints, when demand for bodies creates market that cannot be satisfied through legal means, when society fails to provide ethical framework for necessary activities and thereby ensures those activities will occur unethically. The resurrectionists were criminals and some were murderers, but they were also products of a system that made their crimes profitable and largely protected them from consequences, that needed what they provided even while condemning how they provided it. The graves that were robbed have long since been forgotten. The victims whose bodies were stolen are no longer mourned by anyone who remembers them. The resurrectionists themselves are dead and their names are mostly lost to history, except for the few who were prosecuted and whose crimes were recorded. But the knowledge that was built on those violated graves persists, is taught in medical schools, is applied in surgeries and clinics, continues to benefit the living in ways that are impossible to separate from the suffering and the crimes that made that knowledge possible. The Bedside Historian closes this account of the resurrection men with recognition that history is complicated, that progress often comes through paths that are neither clean nor simple, that the benefits we inherit from past generations sometimes carry costs that were borne by people who had no choice and who received no benefit themselves. The resurrection trade ended nearly 2 centuries ago, but its questions remain relevant, about consent and dignity, about how we treat the dead, about what obligations we carry to those whose suffering enables our advancement, about how we reckon with histories that are both foundational and troubling. May you rest more peacefully than those whose graves were violated in the service of anatomical knowledge. Until we meet again in the darkness where history preserves its uncomfortable truths, where the past remains present in the questions it forces us to answer about who we are and what we value, and how we balance progress against the cost that others pay for our benefit. The candle burns low, the page is turned, and somewhere in Edinburgh and London and in cities across Britain, the graves that were robbed 200 years ago lie quiet now, their violations long forgotten, except in the histories that remember, that bear witness, that refuse to let the resurrection men and their trade fade entirely into the past where crimes might be buried along with the bodies they stole.